Born in 1930 in the rural outskirts of McMinnville, Tennessee, my grandfather experienced a completely different world than I did growing up. With his father dying when he was only 10, his childhood and early years mainly consisted of providing what he could for his mother and sister, mainly by taking care of the family farm. During this time, he also attended school, where he learned many of the stories, games, and life lessons through his peers. These experiences and tales were later passed down to my mother and her two brothers when they were growing up in Muncie in the 1970s. Due to his poor health, he was unable to tell me some of the experiences he had growing up. However, my mother is willing to talk about some of these stories she remembers him telling.
So my dad used to tell a story about Butcher Knife Hollow, which he pronounced it Butcher Knife Holler since he's a hillbilly from Tennessee. And that was an old story about um, there was a really overgrown section of the road in a hollow that he and his sister had to walk through to get to school or to the store or anywhere they wanted to go. And it was really overgrown and had a real thick canopy of trees or vines. And he was told that years ago there used to be a little old crazy lady who lived in there who had actually chopped off a man's hand when he came riding along on the horse and held his hand out to greet her. And she had chopped it off with a butcher knife. And she still, the story goes, she still lives there, or her ghost still haunts that Butcher Knife Hollow. And if the kids are walking through there, especially when it's getting dark at night, they better not hold their hands out because her ghost is likely to chase them and try to chop off their hand. Besides the Butcher Knife Holler legend, Dad would tell us stories related to the moonshiners in that area. He says moonshining was definitely a way of life for some families. It was a known fact, you were either a farmer or a moonshiner. Um, After his dad passed away when he was just about 6 or 7 years old, he had to take over the hunting in the area for food for him. So he was fully aware that as a hunter in the woods, he knew which sections of the woods were off limits because of the stills in that area. And even then, he had to be real careful and watch out for hidden or camouflaged mash barrels that the moonshiners actually mixed their recipes in and let sit. And they would just bury them in the ground and cover them over with some limbs and um, twigs and things. And if you weren't careful walking in the woods, you could step into one and fall in, he said. Um, Another story that was related to that too was about the revenuers. They would always come in and try to catch the moonshiners and destroy their stills. And one particular story was there were two revenuers who approached a little girl who was out in her yard one day, and they went up to her and asked her where her daddy was, and she said she didn't know. And so they went ahead and started looking around the property, and after looking around, they saw and they noticed a path going back into the woods off the back of the house there. So they asked that little girl, "Where's that path lead to?" And she told them, she said, "Oh, you don't want to go down that path. That goes back to my daddy's still, but it don't come back." Dad tells stories about how poor and destitute he was as a young boy, especially after his dad had passed away. He was only 6 or 7 years old, and he said he had to take over a lot of the farming too, as well as the hunting. And they would have to farm with the one horse they had and just a one-horse plow, and he'd have to get behind it and help try to guide that plow. And he has horrible memories about how broke they would be, and they might go over a year without he even having one single red penny in the house, is what he would say. They had to trade and barter, chicken eggs for other items that they might need. Christmas time, he said it wasn't unusual at all. Their Christmas present would just be like an orange in the stocking, and that would be all they would get. Shoes, if they'd have to keep wearing their shoes even though shoes were falling apart. They would start they'd have to use rubber bands or the rubber gaskets from the ball jars back then to wrap around the shoe to hold the sole on if the sole started falling off. So he has some pretty horrible memories of growing up in rural Tennessee. So Dad does talk about some of the fun times he had as a child growing up, revolve around his games or toys, you might say, that he played with. Back then, his fondest memory was making his own slingshot and using slingshots for trying to shoot down some birds. And he said when you made your slingshot, you would want to go pick a nice thick Y branch out of a tree, and then he'd find some rubber bands, or he said if you came across somebody who had an old tire, not that many people back in rural Tennessee even had automobiles or vehicles, but occasionally they could find an old tire and they'd cut a piece of rubber for the elastic band. And then he said you would get a little piece of leather. He said the best thing was actually a tongue out of an old shoe for your little leather pouch that you would put on your little rubber band. And that's how he would make his homemade slingshots. And then he says they had an old apple tree and an old peach tree in their backyard. And especially the peach tree would just be loaded with birds. And he'd go out there with his slingshot and sit back a ways, and he would sit there and shoot at the birds. And he kind of laughs and chuckles when he recalls that and says he got pretty good about shooting the birds. He shot quite a few, but he doesn't ever recall actually even killing one like that, but he would shoot them and knock them down. Some of the other games he would talk about playing was, of course, jacks. Back then, everyone had their jacks that they'd play. And marbles was a real fun game. They said they had different games they would play with the marbles. And one of the funnest ones he recalls was called Rolly Hole. And he said that was just where they would actually take a knife and cut out little holes in the ground and shoot your marbles into the holes. And he said if you had your Rolly Hole court in your yard, no one messed with it. All the kids would come over and use that little Rolly Hole court to shoot their marbles. And he would just laugh and chuckle about no one would mess with your Rolly Hole court. When my brothers and I were growing up, anytime we got hurt or injured and was upset, he would try to calm us down, I guess by almost trivializing our injury compared to something that occurred to him as a boy. He would always say, "Oh, quit your crying. I've had worse places than that on my hind end." And come to find out, that story came about when he was a little boy. He was using a wooden plank to slide down as a slide, and he ended up getting a nice rip in his rear end from an old rusty nail that was sticking up out of it.
A reason for when my grandpa would tell these stories, other than to just simply pass the time or to try and make his kids and grandkids feel better about the current situations they may be dealing with. Nevertheless, these stories show me just how incredibly successful my grandpa has been despite numerous adversities, while remaining as humble as can be. He is truly an inspiration and the best grandpa I could have asked for.